to the governing party. For example, the president could appoint a representative on this independent electoral commission. A case was therefore brought domestically and to the court eventually that alleged that the composition, the law allowing for this composition, was in violation, on the one hand, of the Democracy Charter. I cited to you earlier the provision in the Democracy Charter, Article 17, that says independent electoral commissions should be impartial and independent. The African court found that the loading in favor of the government, as it were, was a violation of the African Democracy Charter. But it went further, and it linked that violation to a violation of Article 13, the right to effective political participation, because it said the composition impartiality will affect the possibility of having the right effectively realized, the right to vote, to effectively participate in politics. The case had a second dimension, and that is that the imbalance in the Independent Electoral Commission was also characterized as being discriminatory, in that it affected members differently in terms of their political affiliation. Once again, the court found that this was a violation both of the African Democracy Charter, Article 10.3, which calls for the equality principle to be observed, and at the same time also a violation of Article 3, the right to equal access to courts and before the law provided for in the African Charter. So once again, we see kind of the symbiotic relationship between human rights, the enforcement of human rights, and the reinforcement of democracy and electoral processes. So to conclude, just to say, I think that we all see, if we look at the African landscape, there had been gradual but consistent and genuine growth in terms of the observance of principles related to human rights, the rule of law, and free and fair elections. It is certainly not a complete work. It's a work in progress. Many commentators raise concerns from time to time, and I'm sure you do too, here where you meet as the Pan-African Parliament. As far as the concerns are, they may relate to what essentially is prevailing at the national level in terms of the media, the judiciary, the independence of the electoral commissions, the extent to which there is political tolerance, and the extent to which there is effective curbing of public power. I want to introduce just another concern, and that relates to a human rights issue that hadn't been mentioned up to now, and that is socio-economic rights. Clearly, a concern is that if the people of a country do not have the sufficient levels of literacy, if they live in conditions of grave squalor, that elections and democracy will be quite hollow and not effectively implementable. So there should also be a view of independence of rights, that it is never a matter of looking only after the civil, political, democracy-related rights, but seeing also the right to education, for example, as reinforcing democracy because it cultivates an educated and well-informed citizenry who ultimately have to make the political decisions. One issue for the agenda perhaps is to look at the further and more universal ratification of the African Charter on Democracy. Only 30 out of 50 states have ratified it so far. But on the other hand, there is the need for effective implementation in those states that have already ratified this treaty. Lastly, I leave in your midst once again the idea that I'm sure you will explore over the course of the day of the Pan-African Parliament's own involvement in ensuring that the effectiveness of these processes is enhanced, and, for example, by effectively involving itself in the process through which states are required to report about their adherence to the values and principles set out in the African Charter on democracy, elections, and governance. I trust that these few remarks would at least serve as a useful context to our further discussion. Thank you very much for the opportunity.
L'exposé qui suit porte...
The next presentation is on transparency and technology-driven elections, the impact of internet shutdowns in Africa. This will be presented by Mrs. Titi Akinsami, the head of public policy and government relations at Google. You have the floor. Thank you.
Bonjour, good morning to everyone. All protocols duly observed. I did struggle with, do I do a presentation or should I actually read? You will permit me to be slightly informal, even though recognizing that I'm in an environment that is very much around protocol. I struggled on doing a presentation or just doing remarks, or outlining my points very specifically. But eventually, I came to the conclusion that I'll stay somewhere in the middle, knowing that Professor Franz has a very, very detailed way of being able to present facts when it comes to the law as well. So I will do a couple of things this morning to make sure I also make my flight, which is in about 4 hours. And I'll start with this. A news headline from 5 days ago. Do we have someone in the room from Kenya? Not yet. It reads, Kenyan election IT head Chris Msando found dead. That was 5 days ago. The Kenya's election will be in 3 days. I shared that to reiterate why this conversation matters. You're no longer at risk as a citizen based on your political leanings, but you're also at risk as someone who is just delivering on their work. As many of you know, the Kenyan elections will be on the 8th of August. Kenya is occupying a unique position in that they have adopted an electronic voting system. But that has also meant that all of a sudden, conversations around the power of technology has become more intertwined with the political system. Access to technology generally in sub-Saharan Africa, in Africa as a whole, is still very much divided though on class, race, age, and your gender. A research done by Research ICT Africa analyzes the gender gap on access to technology. The digital divide is stark when it comes to the urban and the rural divide. Typical service providers, telcos, internet service providers directly, are not keen to provide their services to the sparsely populated rural areas, which have poor infrastructure. Why have I mentioned this? It begins to speak to some feelings of entrenched disenfranchisement, where yes, we adopt technology, but there is the perception that a significant part of the population is left behind. The internet has become ingrained into the tasks that people across the world perform each day, from obtaining information on markets or health, to making mobile payments. The internet had made each of these tasks a lot easier. At the same time, disruptions to internet-based services and infrastructure have become more common. These disruptions have widespread impacts on people and the economy, with even the most minimal disturbance affecting productivity, souring business confidence, and leading to lost opportunities. And now, it matters in South African rand form, in Nigerian naira, in Kenyan shillings. It really matters to our bottom line as nations in Africa. The impacts of a temporary shutdown of the internet, they grow larger as the country develops and as a more mature online ecosystem emerges. It is estimated that for a highly internet-connected country, so think the United States, the United Kingdom, places in Europe, that per day the impact of a temporary shutdown of the internet and all of its services would be an average of $23.6 million per 10 million population. I'll repeat that. The average cost of a temporary internet shutdown is $23.6 million per 10 million population. In countries with lower access to the internet, so to some extent, a lot of our countries on the continent, the average estimated GDP impact amount to $6.6 million and to 0.6 million per 10 million population for medium and low internet connectivity economies, respectively. I'll read the numbers again. $6.6 million to 0.6 million per 10 million. Born and bred in Lagos, lived in South Africa, in Johannesburg for the last 15 years. I know the average population in any of the big cities is way past 10 million. So think about the fact that every time somebody decides, I want to just shut it down a little, let's throttle it. Let's make it a bit harder for people to be able to get information. Let's make it slightly harder for communication to happen. Because sincerely, we don't seem to have control over the conversations that are happening on the internet. We lose an average, $6.6 million. I want that to sink in a bit. Then let's make it a bit more practical. Removing the politics from it. For the month and a half, actually more than a month and a half, that the internet was shut down in English-speaking Cameroon, think about the millions of dollars that potentially was lost. I am happy to say that during that shutdown, there was a young man, an app developer, who decided to connect to something that we as Google were doing, develop an app, and against all odds, he would travel, plus or minus, I think, about 4 hours every day to make sure he could continue developing the app. Guess what? He won. So folks, in as much as we are in the age of technology, we're in a space where we believe that there needs to be certain controls put in place. We need to balance it out. Yes, you impact on rights. But more importantly, for economies like ours that are looking to develop, leapfrog, breach the digital divide, for every time we take a political decision to shut down the internet, we are letting money, not out of the back door or the window, through our very front doors. Between July 1, 2015 and June 30, 2016, internet shutdowns cost at least $2.4 billion in GDP. So I mentioned Cameroon. Think Uganda. Those are spaces where consistently, for every time we shut down, the private sector is losing money, government is losing revenue, individuals are losing their businesses. Direct impact on a day-to-day basis. The centrality of the internet to social and economic life recently led the United Nations to enact a resolution supporting the promotion, protection, and enjoyment of human rights on the internet. The resolution specifically condemns unequivocally measures to intentionally prevent or disrupt access to or dissemination of information online in violation of international human rights law, and calls on all states to refrain from and seize such measures, unequivocally. So I have a couple of questions before I sit down and, we have an interaction. One, are African governments embracing the internet and mobile technology to improve the lives of their citizens? I'm not responding to the questions. This is the Pan-African Parliament. Second, if they are, In which specific ways are these happening? Are we, as the leadership, taking leadership and driving momentum around the adoption of technology and its use in governance? The biggest challenge we find is not only in how to grow the technology sector on our continent, but also how to make sure that that sector interfaces with other sectors of the economy. And that's why you'll have a representative of Google sitting in, or standing in front of you and speaking around elections and technology, because it matters. Let me speak briefly about investor confidence. The ability for any foreign direct investment to actually stay in country is very much determined by the political leadership and their demonstration of allowing the free flow of the economy. The ability of the local economy to grow is very much dependent on the ability of the political leadership and the government to strengthen the small to medium-sized economic sector. So my questions to you is this: are we, as the African continent, as the government, as the Pan-African Parliament, enabling our citizenry and the community to take the most advantage of technology, particularly internet technologies, to leapfrog the technology opportunities that exist? As Google, our key role is that of an intermediary. We provide the platform, products, services, that enables government's capacity to better deliver on its policy promises to citizenry. And on the other hand, help citizens to better engage with government and exercise their constitutional rights. Which then means sometimes we're caught in the middle. So the internet has come to play an important role in elections worldwide, globally, in Africa, from making it easier for voters to find information, to enabling exchange of views, to increasing voters' engagement with decision makers, and vice versa. And sincerely, if I look at the Nigerian election, for example, in 2015, it's completely changed how African voters approach the polls. So the conversation is not only about who you can actually see on the ground as a politician. It's gone to the level of how much influence do you also have on the internet. Voters, we have seen, continue to search for information on candidates, parties, and polling units. Ability to be able to share the data is limited right now, but post the elections in Kenya, you'd be amazed at the kinds of searches and where they're coming from shanties to the cities. They're looking for communities, voters are looking for communities to share information, to be able to verify information. Think about the elections in the United States, and all of a sudden, the idea of fake news. I take a step back and I say to myself, fake news, it's such a contradiction. News is supposed to be that which you go to that is consistently able to tell you the truth. And all of a sudden, we're dealing with fake news and the controversies around that election. But where do people go to look or to find that information? The internet. Increasingly, we have apps and platforms that allow voters to report events from polling units, sector stations, making elections more engaging, more social, more open. The key driver or goal is to take part in the process and the ability to make informed democratic positions. So my question again is, to us as the African government, as the Pan-African Parliament, how are we ensuring that the citizenry are able to make the best use of these technologies during the elections in various countries? It's completely irrelevant if the policy and regulatory environment is stifling. If we truly want to become a strong Africa, united and influential, a well-respected global player, it is up to us, and when I say us, I speak as a Nigerian by birth, who works at Google and with Google, including the Pan-African Parliament members that I speak to today. But more importantly, beyond this space, taking our ability to be able to influence policies and regulations outside. It is up to us to make a success of the talent that emerges from the commitments that a Google has made. Thank you very much.
شكرا جزيلا.
Thank you very much. I would like to, on behalf the chairperson of the committee and on behalf of all the honorable members of the Pan-African Parliament, to thank all the presenters for their inspiring presentations and very important that touches the lives of the African people and the African states. I thank all of them for this initiative, and I also would like to thank them for the diverse topics that were presented and the practical aspect that was debated today. They are not of theoretical nature, but they are also very relevant and pertinent in terms of evaluating our current state and how we could help all those present in taking the lessons forward. I also would like to thank the Pan-African Parliament members who are present in this workshop, and it's a very good indication on how relevant it is to our topic in the African conversation. I would like to open the forum now for questions so that we can take the questions from the forum. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, Chairperson. I'm Honorable Mbeya. I would like to welcome the quality of the presentations done by the two speakers. I would like to start with a few contributions. First of all, on the second presentation, on the issue of the impact of internet technology upon our economies on the African continent. African countries want to enter into this competition, but unfortunately they're facing inequality in relation to the Western states. Because African countries are facing major challenges, we need to feed our people, we need to educate them, and those are the challenges we are facing. We have two major challenges. The first of all is ownership of the knowledge of technology and internet tools, and this implies the issue of education that was mentioned by the first speaker, but especially the issue of electricity in our countries. I come from a country where the level of electrification throughout the country is extremely weak, and a lot of our citizens do not have access to electricity and therefore do not have access to internet. So this is a major issue. But I just wanted to make comments rather, and it's on the first presentation. President Nkodo, in his opening statement, talked about Blaise Pascal. And I wanted to cite Montaigne, who says, if we're not, the word awareness is a weapon that is used by the human being and has a profound role in the scientific aspect, especially when it comes to good governance and democracy. And this requires a mastery of education to have literacy and training of citizens. And this can be summarized through the need to knowing how to read and write as well as calculate. And secondly, they emphasize the economic aspect when it comes to effective democracy, because democracy cannot work with poverty. And it is evident, I'm just citing one example, but it is evident that a country that is not able to use its own public funds to organize the elections will find that they have problems. I was an observer for the African Union in a country, Algeria. I was in the region of Beira, and I can assure you that the state of Algeria is one of the African states that is able to bear the cost of organizing election. And that's real democracy, because democracy has a cost, especially an economic cost. You need to have the resources to support the effective functioning of democracy. But I'm not going to spend too much time on the floor, but I just wanted to finish with the issue of authoritarian regimes in Africa that was mentioned by the professor, especially just after the independence period. Looking at my country in particular, after the independence, after the 60s, my country had democracy, as was the case with other African countries. But there are issues that then led to authoritarian systems. And I'm talking about my country indeed, but there's also the example of Senegal. I think our colleague from Senegal is in this room, and there was a rivalry between the president and others led to a lot of changes in the practices of Senegal. But thank you very much for the quality of the presentation. Thank you very much.
Merci, Madame la Présidente de séance.
Thank you, the chairperson of the session. I would also like to thank the two presenters for their presentations that were complementary in nature and also were food for thought.
Aussi bien sur le plan juridique.
From a legal standpoint and with regards to human rights, democracy, elections, and governance in Africa. And as a consequence, transparency in elections that are based upon technology. Before making a small input, if I can, I just wanted to make a comment on the two presentations. I think that we need to put things in perspective when it comes to the internet and Google. Google is just a tool of technology. It's a driver it's a search engine where you can access information. And it helps to get information, and if it's not smart information, it means that you have noise or silence. And silence is information that you need, but that information doesn't reach us, either because the search engine has not been able to provide the correct information, even though it exists. With regards to the topic at hand, as you know, last year, we had the celebration of the World Day of Democracy. I think that was in September. And the Interparliamentary Union called upon national parliaments to reflect upon democracy for 2030. As you know, that the target was 2030. And why this issue? Because we have technology and we have development as well. And development, of course, democratic debate, but they shouldn't remain compartmentalized within the parliament. They need to make sure that they convey in real time their messages to the population. For instance, you can talk about the e-parliaments. I believe that our national parliaments have not made sufficient advances in that particular area. You need to ensure that the population participates in democratic debates through technology, and it's necessary for parliamentarians to react effectively in real time to their electorate. And then we have the elections. We have talked about elections. I think what we can look at is the movement towards the use of technology in elections. If you want to have transparent elections that are free and effective, elections that can actually build the trust amongst the citizens, you need to introduce the notion of technology. The first step, you might find that you have a mix between the traditional approach in elections, and then on the other hand, you have technology support. For instance, you might have I was an observer in Cape Verde, and I had an experience that was practical. Through technology, you could have a data center that brings together all the information that is produced by the polling stations and the various constituencies, and in real time, for instance, you knew the rate of participation, and this was in real time that you could get that information. And when it came to counting votes and of course, gathering the results, you could use the data centers and through the internet to gather all the results, and in a more transparent manner, you could have these. So this is a reality that existed, and we all need to move towards that. And the second step, and this actually goes beyond other continents, is electronic voting. Instead of going directly to a polling station and instead of using papers and documentation, instead you use an election portal that makes it possible for each citizen to vote and to fulfill their right to vote in a free manner wherever they are and at whatever time during the election phase. Technology. In technology, you use tools and applications, etc. But I think I understand where Google plays a role, but technology is very broad and very effective in nature. So this is what I wanted to say. And this is what we can move towards. And instead of democracy in the future, you could talk about e-democracy or electronic democracy. Democracy that makes it possible to go closer to the citizens. And this is very fundamental when it comes to the public authorities. So they need to move towards technology and set up the notion of electronic administration or e-administration that makes it possible to have effective and transparent governance that is good at all levels of government. So this is a challenge that Africa is supposed to address, because when you look at the last rankings of the UN in 2016 in terms of the electronic or the e-governance index, we were lagging behind other continents. So we need to make a real effort, and perhaps we need, when we're looking at infrastructure issues, etc., we need to bear in mind that there are skills available to do this. I heard mention of the commitments by Google in Africa in terms of digital skills in Africa. We have those skills in Africa. We have African skills in other countries, But those skills are being exported and used in other continents. Our IT experts are everywhere around the world. So we need to make a real effort at national and continental level to address this. Thank you very much.
Merci.
Thank you for that. I am Okiebama from Burkina Faso. I would also like to commend and encourage the initiative of the Pan-African Parliament to strengthen our capacities as parliamentarians. From my viewpoint, as was said by the previous speaker, don't you think it would be more relevant to deal with the issue of electrification in the cities and in the various suburbs before moving on to the ownership of IT tools and training? Thank you.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. شكرا جزيلا سيدة الرئيسة.
Thank you. My name is Bashir Ali Muhammad Ali from Sudan. I would like to thank the Pan-African Parliament for importance in presenting such a capacity-building session for all the Pan-African Parliament members. And we also thank all those who are present in this workshop, in specifically the University of Pretoria and the Center for Human Rights, and also a warm welcome to all our honorable members and present with us here today. My intervention is made of 4 components in terms of the role of the Pan-African Parliament as per the thematic items that were debated this morning. In terms of the human rights, we have currently 30 countries that have only ratified this charter, and this also affects the African Union, that should work tirelessly to speed up the ratification of this charter and to abide by its principles in terms of democracy, governance, and human rights. And that's why the Pan-African Parliament should provide a long-term plan to facilitate the ratification and to avoid the intervention of any other state outside the African continent in our internal affairs. The Pan-African Parliament also should provide model laws to facilitate transparency and good governance. That in collaboration with the regional parliaments, so that there is no separation of powers between what comes in those model laws and what is in the national laws. Thirdly, I believe that technology is a necessity for the dissemination of knowledge among people. And for this technology to be useful to our continent and its people, I believe that there should be laws that should govern its usage, and the African Union has an important role financially and technically to support the usage of such technology from a technical aspect and a legal aspect. And the African Union and the Parliament also should provide a model law that should protect the usage of this technology and to avoid its harmful usage.
Very much. Honourable members, I want to thank the presenters for their very eloquent and very informative presentation. But I have some issues to raise this morning with Mrs. Titi Akinsami. I thought the point that we should discuss should have been different. We should not be accessing the impact of internet shutdown in Africa, but we should actually be discussing the impact of universal access to internet in Africa. That should have been the point that we should be discussing. Because of a lack of access or difficulty of access to internet of Africa, it has affected the outcome of elections in Africa. We should be looking at the cost of internet in Africa. We should look at the cost of technology, buying technology for conducting election. Like you said, it is the first time Kenya is doing it. What is the cost that they are going to face? We should look at the lack of skills in Africa in terms of internet and technology as Pan-African Parliament. We should also be looking at the training that we are giving our people. Are we training our people to access internet? Are we giving them the best method that they should be using in Africa? Are we talking about deepening access? We should actually be now assessing how far have we gone with the access to internet in Africa. That would be good for all of us. What about the technology that our people are using? Is it user-friendly? Are our people who are uneducated are able to use the internet that we have? I think that is where I want my sister to explain to this gathering, because this is the most important to me. Access to internet, it is what the Pan-African Parliament should be discussing. That Africa, every corner of Africa, every village of Africa should have access to technology. And how far should we do it? And how can we do it? Thank you very much.
Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, Chair. I would also like to commend Professor Franz and Madame Titi for the quality of their presentations. My comments are going to focus on a number of points, the first one being in the African Charter on Democracy, Governance and Elections. Professor Franz alluded to the recommendation concerning the organs responsible for elections, in other words, the independent electoral commissions. Today, those independent electoral commissions are political or technical, and in certain countries, it is the governments that organize elections. It's the ministry responsible for administration. I would like to know how he feels about these different types of institutions responsible for organizing elections. And with regards to the African Charter on Democracy, Governance and Elections, what are his recommendations in order to ensure the credibility of elections? Because that's what we want. Secondly, I would like to admit that there is a huge gap between developed and developing countries when it comes to elections. Because, for instance, in France, you'll find that there are elections that are organized, and within a few hours you have the results, whereas in Africa, apart from certain countries, you need to wait for a while for the results. And all this is a problem. And elections are becoming more and more expensive because they're recommending the biometric system as a means of enhancing credibility. And often you'll find that the technical and financial partners are responsible for the elections. And this is a bit awkward when it comes to sovereignty. And this is something that we need to address in order to be able to find strategies in order to assist governments. And finally, in view of these costs, there is an election that was held recently in Gambia where they used a technology using he used beans, I think it was, and this is because it is expensive to organize elections, but there is a very simple procedure that has had problems when it comes to transparency, and you'll find that the president then lost the election. So what do you think of that type of election approach as we saw in Gambia? Thank you.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم شكرا للأخت الرئيس.
Thank you for the opportunity. My name is Kamal Ali Madini. I'm also a member of the Sudanese Parliament, and I would like to thank our Pan-African Parliament members for allowing us to be here and to share. Sorry? Microphone? Microphone? Yes? Please, go ahead. Translation into French. The translation into French. There is a problem in the translation into French. French booth, thank you. We begin again. My name is Kamal Ali Madani. I'm a member of the Sudanese Parliament. I thank our colleagues in the Pan-African Parliament for allowing us this opportunity to participate in this workshop and to gain from the experiences of others. I have very limited interventions to abide by the limited amount of time allocated per intervention. The professor has stated, Professor Filyun, that there are prerequisites for democracy, such as human rights and inclusivity. Human rights and the lack of marginalization are very important. Then he added later in his intervention or in his presentation the speech around the freedom of express and the access to information. My comment in that regard specifically that human rights, which are applied through the principles are Western enshrined, and they are methods to facilitate applying pressure on the African states through measures that are not specifically suitable for our African countries. For example, Sudan, we, until a very long period of time, subject to Article 7 of the human rights, and we felt that we could not find a way out of this article to eliminate some of those pressures that were applied over Sudan. Yet there is a great deal of democracy in Sudan. We have elections for local governments and governments at a provincial and a regional, and then there is the elections at the state level. We have parliaments, national parliaments, and parliaments for the local governments itself, and we have various mechanisms that are implemented effectively. Yet the other aspect of the practice of inclusivity and inclusion, we believe that the situation in Cameroon, for example, that in Cameroon, our people of the south of Cameroon that felt that they were not included in the and practiced their democratic rights. We found that that the committee that this is not an application of marginalization, but it is a lack of inclusivity. And I believe that the falsification by others of people that are not even included in this election. Technology can come later in the counting of the votes and in the rather later stages of the election, but not in the early stages through the pushing of the buttons. Thank you all. Thank you very much. Again, I go back to reiterate that we need to be concise in our interventions and questions. Go ahead. Thank you.
I'll be concise. Let me also join the colleagues who have commended the presenters for excellent presentations, very informative, and I think very thought-provoking, contemporary issues of digital technology and their impact on our lives. I would like the presenters to put their minds, I think, to one very specific issue which they have raised, namely the interface of digital technology to socio-economic rights. That hasn't quite come out very strongly, especially how in Africa we can use digital technology to improve the quality of life of the youth in particular, and the marginalized, especially those in the rural areas. How to create hope for employment, generation of employment through new skills that are coming out of digital technology, which will eventually impact on poverty, raising people into prosperity. I think those are very critical socio-economic rights of our people on the continent, to which we should be directing digital technology skills. And I would like to hear more of that challenge at that level of interface. I'm Professor Jeffrey Longwangwa from Zambia. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Again, I also want to add my congratulations to the presentation. I'm mindful that Madam Titi has a flight to catch, and she may be, needed to reply to a few things. To Professor Fulyun, thank you for this handbook. I think much of what you said with regard to the Charter on Human Rights needs to be workshopped with our members of parliament, because you were quoting Article 13, and I think a few of them may not, we have a rotation here where members come in and out and all may not be au fait. So I would like to urge possibly the clerk of the parliament to organize a workshop with you leading it, sir, on the charter itself. I would like to talk to the concept of the African courts. Recently, Africa has been part of South Africa's move to withdraw from the ICC, saying that the ICC is biased and depend on the African court rather to deliver justice for Africa. But the track record, to be quite honest, is not very good in the sense that maybe judgments are made, but they don't have the power to implement those judgments. So I would like to have your comment on that. Also, especially in, also to comment possibly on the review of the African court. I sense a great deal of negativity around the use of electronic means for electioneering, and I think maybe case examples of how India does it, how Germany does it, perhaps visually seeing how it works may help to get rid of that negativity. There's no fraud, there's no kind of, every household in Africa, almost every household in Africa has got a cell phone. They have access to social media. Politics, is now all about social media. Our electioneering is not so much about pamphlets and door-to-door as much as it is about using social media. A question to Ms. Titi. Given that there is such a high loss to the economy, your figures were quite, astounding. Yet, in countries like Uganda, when the president and his motorcade goes past, there is signal jamming. You cannot get a cell phone. People cannot function. You can't use the ATMs. Surely there has to be a mechanism that can be more useful to the security of the presidents rather than signal jamming at the cost of that amount of dollars to the economy. I thank you.
أستسمح منكم لأنه المنظمين
I would like to ask from all the presenters that would like to finalize this morning's session of our program. And I go back to saying that we have very limited amount of time, so I will only take two interventions, one from the left and one to right. And again, please focus your questions to the honorable sister who has a plane to catch. And obviously, with Professor Filyun will be available for the latter part of the day with us, so therefore we could continue with the questions to Professor Filyun. I will only take two questions from the sister and the brother on this side, and two from this side. And again, focus your questions to the honorable sister who has a flight, and due to her commitment, she wouldn't be with us. Go ahead.
Oui, Madame, j'ai la parole.
Do I have the floor, ma'am?
Madam President, I'm Anifa Kawoya from Uganda, and like my other colleagues, I want to commend all the presentations, and especially Professor, whose presentation was all inclusive in the context of relevance of Article 13 of our African Charter. Is it on now? Which one now? French, I can speak French? No. Is it on now? Okay. As I'm saying, Madam, I was commending the professor for an inclusiveness presentation in the context of and in the relevance of Article 13 of AU Charter as far as the enhancement of human rights, good governance, democratization process, and free and fair election. And I want to say that I'm in agreement on the observations of political stability as a major driver of human rights and all those other components. And of course, a case in point is Uganda, which has been mentioned by my sister, Mrs. Titi, and the chair of the Human Rights Committee. As far as Uganda is concerned, definitely, as already observed by the professor, in the 1970s, the situation was so absurd. But currently, due to the political stability in the country and the democratization process, there is much improvement as far as Uganda is concerned. Having said that, I wanted Professor to hear more about Africa, and to be specific, Africa leaders and constitutionalism. Because now currently what is on the African continent is in the area of constitutionalism. More often than not, constitutions are changed to suit the individual's interests, having in mind that there are processes under which a constitution can be changed, amended. And I'm saying this because I had a chance to participate in the promulgation of the Ugandan constitution in 1995. And I know the articles that were entrenched can be changed, cannot be changed. Fair and a free election. And for what one country says this is not fair and free, maybe my country in Uganda, for example, we look at it as fair and free. And I've never had any of the observers in all the elections I've participated in, I've been in parliament for 25 years, saying Uganda didn't have fair and free election. The observers say it was this with some few frauds. I thank you.
Merci, Madame.
Thank you, Madam Chairperson. Let me thank the two presenters. My problem is mainly the key word to exchange experiences. I think this type of workshop is not necessarily useful sometimes, because we don't receive documents in good time before the workshop does take place. I think that would have helped us a lot in terms of contribution, and also share experiences with fellow participants. But the problem is that these documents do not reach us in time. Otherwise, I think the topic is extremely interesting and useful. Supposing that the documents were sent to us before because now I think we're talking about electronic messaging and so on, so that would have been a tool to be used to send us documents anyway. So as far as the Pan-African Parliament is concerned, I think what one can say, therefore, is that these presentations are interesting, but the question that I want to ask is what is the assessment that you make, positive assessment that you make in terms of what the presenters can bring to bear on Africa's progress and how better to access internet in the 53 countries of the AU, because that will be extremely useful so that we know if we are making good progress. And the key word here that has been developed, the role of human rights, and the role of democracy in countries, and the role of technology in elections. I think these are extremely interesting words. But as we make progress, I think it will be proper that we also look at the assessment of the positive aspects that need to be borne in mind. Because what remains to be done for the future and what are the future perspectives or outcomes that we are going to look at. I think these needs to maybe need to be broadened and explained further.
I again ask that the departure of the Honourable Sister to cut short the rest of the interventions. She would like to answer the questions that were presented so far. So if I can allow her the opportunity to answer and respond to the questions.
Thank you, ma'am. Again, my apologies, but I do need to catch a flight. I will do my best to respond to all the questions that have been raised. I will request that the team from the Center for Human Rights can compile if there are any other questions. I'll do my best to respond to it from the plane so that there are responses by the end of the day. Very quickly, I think there's some misconceptions. Google is more than search. Starting from the very beginning, Google is an amazing institution. We are more than search. Search is one of many products and applications that we have in terms of a platform. I will ask a very practical question. How many people here have a Samsung or an Android phone? How many of you realize that Android is actually a Google product? So significantly, what I see, and this is to the House, is that I'm more than happy to put on the table a demonstration, an opportunity to be able to do a training for the members of Parliament on some of the freely available at no cost platforms that Google makes available for collaboration, for meetings that come at no cost. So more than happy to put that on the table, and that is why we would have this conversation. Because if you think about it, you think about elections, immediately people are speaking about e-voting. But the power of maps, the power of collaborative platforms where you can use Google Docs, for example, the power of a YouTube, or if we even mention Facebook, the ability to be able to use this to communicate, to share information in real time, to ensure transparency, to manage trends. There's something called Google Trends. Those are the things that we as Africans can harness immediately without any significant financial commitment. There's a word we like to use. It's called scrappy. Google believes in being scrappy. The ability to be able to use what you have on hand to leapfrog and be able to participate economically. So it's not of one or the other. Technology, the internet is an enabler, and we cannot, because of lack, because I kept getting this comments back and forth, yes, we need electrification. I'm telling you, as I speak to you here, I mentioned earlier I'm a Nigerian, born and bred actually, I'm from the western part of the Niger Delta. There's no tarred road to my village. We've not had electricity since 2002. We eventually got an electrification pole in 2002, but there's not been power on it. But excuse me, I can make mobile calls from my village. I can charge it. Why? Because we harness the power of the sun and we harness the power of water, and we harness the power of human beings actually doing exercises to generate power. So, in as much as I recognize as an African that we have issues around infrastructure, electricity, there are concerns around food, we cannot, because of that, and this goes to the other questions that came in that line, close our eyes and say until we solve our ability to be able to go up these steps on the left, we are not going to see that there's actually an accessible path that will get us to the same conclusion, which is becoming a relevant global player. Forgive me if I'm very blunt. I'm a passionate African. This is why I do what I do. And this is why I will continue to preach the gospel that technology is a critical part of the solutions that we're looking for, be it electrification, be it solving the poverty issues, talk about wars. This is what we need to do. We need to get to the point where we embrace technology. And then to the second point, when I say we're providing digital skills, instantly people think, oh, it's technical skills and our IT folks are leaving the continent. Absolutely not. And I'm very proud to tell you my first degree is in English. The second is in knowledge management. The third is actually in French. I do not have a technology degree. But I work for a technology company. Why? Because I have an understanding of the power of technology and the ability to be able to take that power of technology to interpret it so that people understand how they can connect to it to make a difference in their lives. I'm sitting today, I've been in this sector probably for the last 17 years. 17 years prior to that, I was on the streets of Lagos selling pure water. Ask your Nigerian colleagues about pure water. I've sold ice block on the streets of Lagos. Why am I able to sit here today? Because somebody understood and made me understand that technology is not just about having the technical coding skills, but more so being empowered to be able to harness the creativity others have put in place. So our commitment to train 10 million African youth is directly assessing that, to help them harness the power of technology to solve the problems around food, around wars, around political crisis, to give them a voice where otherwise they would have no voice, to have an opportunity for governments to learn that open data and transparency is key to tenure succession. Let's speak a bit more. I've spoken about electrification. You know, the access conversation, this is a question we get all the time, that while we're talking, I try to infer to it, again, we have a limited time, and this particular session is around a particular issue. Access is more than infrastructure. You can Google it. I have a paper on access to access. So yes, in trying, it's again the question of the chicken or the egg or the chicken, which comes first. In my local language, of the internet balloon that came down in, I think it was in KwaZulu-Natal, that's some of the experimental things that we are putting in place. How can you take old technology, helium balloons, up in the air, merge it with the power of wireless technology, and provide internet access, irrespective of your location physically? That's already in place and it's happening. But all of that amounts to total nothing if the political and the regulatory environment consistently sees this as the antagonistic thing. So when there is disagreement, we shut it down. That is what this conversation is about. The fact that we need to recognize that we cannot make an enemy of technology while we solve any other problems. I think I will wrap it up at that point. Again, thank you very much. A lot of humility, a lot of respect, and I will try my best to respond to any other questions as the day goes along, using the power of technology. Thank you.
Thank you very much to the Honorable Sister. I thank her for her answers and her determination to leapfrog our African situation to a place that is more promising. Her enthusiasm in delivering her vision that could provide prosperity and success for our future generations and our people on the ground. This is what we aim to achieve for all our people. We hope that you have a safe journey and enjoy your stay for whatever is left of it, and we'll see you again.
تفضل الأخ البروفيسور على
We can now give an opportunity for Professor Viljoen to answer the questions that were raised by the honorable members.
Thank you very much for the interesting, thought-provoking comments and questions. I will answer, I think, 4 specific questions. The first relates to the relationship essentially between the electoral, civil and political rights and socio-economic rights. I think it is very clear that ideally democracy and elections will function best when there is a good level of socio-economic rights. The right to education and basic living conditions had been met. But clearly, education, living conditions, ensuring those require resources from the state. And it is obvious that many of our states have limited resources and they are not yet fulfilling all those socioeconomic rights to the fullest extent possible. Now, clearly, it would not be possible to wait for civil and political rights for elections until such time as we have the ideal socioeconomic rights conditions. It is perhaps exactly when there are limited resources that the right to vote, perhaps not ideal in all respects, but that the right to vote plays a role in ensuring transparency and accountability for the use of those limited resources, so that in fact the socioeconomic benefits may be enlarged through ensuring accountability and transparency. And in that way, there's like a cyclical relationship between, I think, ensuring the democratic rights and then achieving and ensuring socioeconomic rights. There was a question about the kind of administrative or government-run electoral processes and perhaps one's view. I would refer back to the Africa Democracy Charter, which puts the requirement as that of impartial and independent national electoral commissions. If one looks at the Commission and the Court on Human and People's Rights interpretation, independence would mean that the entity organizing the election should not depend for its authority on the state itself. And as far as impartiality is concerned, that the entity should not suffer from an appearance of being biased. So I think if one uses those 2 principles, where is the authority of the body located, and is there a reasonable apprehension of bias in its composition or the way it functions, then it would certainly not fulfill the ideal of impartiality and independence as set out in the Africa Democracy Charter. There was an issue raised, I think, by the member of the Sudanese delegation around perhaps the Western nature of rights, in particular freedom of expression. I suppose, I mean, that is a long philosophical debate, but in terms of the issue at hand, if one looks at the Africa Democracy Charter, it clearly contains these human rights related provisions. So if it was not clear, I was quoting actually from the African Democracy Charter itself, which in Article 2 refers to access to information and freedom of the press as the founding values that the state parties adhere to. And there are numerous provisions in this Africa Democracy Charter which refers back to human rights as a framework within which human rights and electoral processes work in tandem. And I do note that Sudan is a state party to the Africa Democracy Charter. So I think in a sense then that to some extent refutes the notion that the mere use and reliance on human rights is a Western imposition. The AU itself and the members that have become party to this have appropriated the human rights framework and saw, I think, through the inclusion in the African Democracy Charter, the usefulness of those values and principles. The issue was also raised around the African Court and its weaknesses. In terms of its relationship with the International Criminal Court, may I just make the perhaps clarification that the African Court on Human and People's Rights is there to hold states accountable for their human rights commitments, whether they're in the African Charter or in the African Democracy Charter. The African Court, as it exists today in Arusha, is not mandated to decide on the criminal culpability of any individual or state representative. So the fact that a government may say, we will stand away from the ICC because there is an African court which can try international crimes, for the moment that is not correct, because there is no African court that can hear international crimes, because the African court in Arusha is only there to hear whether states are in line with their obligations. As you know, in Malabo, when your PAP protocol was amended, there was also an amendment adopted to the African Court Protocol. So in the future, there may be a court in Africa with individual criminal jurisdiction, but that court does not exist yet because the protocol that will create it is not yet in force. And as for the invitation or the possibility, clearly we would be very honored and privileged to have a further form of engagement around any issues related to human rights and democratization if such an opportunity would arise. Thank you again for the opportunity.
شكرا جزيلا. أعتقد على أنه
Thank you very much for the opportunity, and we have to abide by the specific time that was allocated in the program. However, we believe that we will continue with our deliberations for the topics raised today, because the various thematic items that are all relevant to the same items that we've discussed this morning. So whatever was not discussed this morning, I believe that we'll have an opportunity in the afternoon to continue in the afternoon session. Again, I thank Professor very much, and also I thank the Pan-African Parliament for this opportunity and the good preparation for these important thematic topics. And I thank all the members who have joined and participated, and I apologize if I haven't been able to give you the opportunity to participate. The next item on the program is to take the